So first of all, on the left in this slide, you can see Debora Randall. She is in Nairobi. And Debora is the Technical Director for NU-TEC MD, which is a Uganda-based market development program funded by DFID and implemented by Palladium and Swiss Contact. In the middle, we have Collins Apuoyo, who is actually in Kampala right now, and he's Chief of Party for the USAID Feed the Future Inclusive Agriculture Markets Program, a new program implemented by Technoserve and Market Share together led by DAI Global. And then on the right, we have Warwick Thomson. He's the independent director of two Ugandan companies, AB Finance and AB Development. He's also been an independent consultant working for 20 years. And although he spent a lot of time in Uganda, he's currently in New Zealand. That's why he's locked down. Okay, so let's start. I would like to start by throwing a question at you, Colin. And my question is, you've heard that Uganda is in total lockdown, but can you tell us exactly what that means and what it feels like on the ground?
Thank you very much, Mike. I want to start by saying that the situation is improving quite a bit. Last night we got some little easing of situations here, so we are better off. But over the last 7 weeks, we have had very restricted movements where during the day, public and private vehicles were not allowed on the roads. There is a curfew that starts from 6 o'clock in the evening and goes until 5:30 in the morning. And what that meant is that most businesses remained closed during this period. Offices were closed, and the best somebody could do was to walk to the nearest shop or nearest market to buy food. So that essentially meant most economic and social activity have been closed during the last 7 weeks. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds pretty severe. Warwick, what's been the impact in the sort of finance area?
Well, there's a bit of a lag in getting reports out of banks and out of the finance institutions, but the initial intelligence that we're getting is that there's a fair bit of confidence starting to evaporate out of the supply chains. Liquidity's drying up in the banking system, or it's being challenged. The perception of risks by banks, of course, has increased considerably. So the whole financing of agricultural trade, and I'm sure most other things, is really slowing down. Also with finance simply not being made available to people in the countryside. And with that comes a general erosion in confidence. People are concerned that their invoices won't be paid. The sort of whole transactions that go on between people start to just generally be a bit more safe, or don't happen at all. And for us, of course, we're really concerned that we've got a crop that needs to go into the ground soon, the second season, and we're really worried that if that might not happen, and that the businesses that would normally finance that and trade that crop will start showing a lot of stress.
So, Debora, perhaps what does this mean for people living in poverty and smallholder farmers particularly?
I mean, I think interestingly, we know that, based on in West Africa and the Ebola health crisis a few years ago, that it impacted a lot of the informal sector, informal laborers, workers, those that are self-employed, probably often more in the towns and the urban areas. So I think there's a number of, we're realizing that might be the situation also in Uganda and probably in other places as well. and it's a shame because that's often been the recently emerged poor, you know, those that have been able to kind of tip into the, you know, not in that bottom poor. So it'll be still, we're waiting to see what the impact will be. We know in terms of in the agricultural sector, you know, farmers are still farming. There is some question as to whether, you know, subsistence farmers may be impacted less because they're less reliant on inputs or on selling their products, their harvest. But, you know, you know, most people do sell something. So we are, as Warwick was saying, maybe concerned about how farmers will be impacted later on if they're not able to harvest because they don't have the labor, let's say, or they don't have the markets to sell to. So it still remains to be seen, but that's the situation a bit now.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, when you look at it from a broader level, there are studies that have been done that are showing that the overall impact on growth, economic growth in Uganda, will cause a decrease from 6% to 4.6%. But also when you take into account that 80% of the population of Uganda or labor force in Uganda are actually employed in the informal sector, then a case where an economy is locked down, then the impact on jobs for the informal sector is quite huge. It is estimated it might be up to 4.4 million people falling out of jobs in the informal sector. But specifically, the impact on agribusinesses is going to be quite severe. Let me explain why.
Sure.
Most institutional buyers have closed down during this period. And we know that schools, hospitals, and other institutions are major consumers of agricultural products. With those institutions closed, the impact on agribusinesses that supply them is huge.
Okay, yeah, I can see. So, look, to put it, I mean, I'm sure that similar situations are happening in other countries. So let's look at our role as market systems development programs. I suppose the question I want to ask is this one. How should we respond? Is it about a total change in direction? I mean, is it about a total change in direction, or is it about a pivot, or is it about just adding some supplementary activities to what you're doing already? Maybe I could start with you, Warwick, in the financial sector. What do you think there? You're muted, Warwick.
Sorry, newbie. I think what we I think what we need to be very, very focused on is protecting the very hard-won gains of the last couple of decades. If you look at the financial and agricultural landscape in Uganda today, it bears very little resemblance to what it did a couple of decades ago in terms of how we farm, how much we produce, and the enormous trading and processing infrastructure and industry that's associated with that. So basically, this is the time where we need to come out really quite quickly to support that these supply chains can remain as trading propositions. So I think for us, we need to act really quickly. We need to think about doing things that would normally go a little bit against our principles, make some quite quick decisions, and be prepared to pay levels of support and do things we wouldn't normally do. For example, triaging companies, selecting the ones that are really strategically important and have a good chance of survival, and even helping them as far as paying some of their fixed costs, which would have been totally against the grain a few months ago. But it won't help us if we come out the other side of this to find that they are no longer there.
Okay. Collins, what are your thoughts?
Right. I think it is important to understand where a program or a project or an activity is at this particular time. So I would start by saying there are three considerations before you decide whether to pivot, whether to change completely, or whether just to add supplementary activities. Those three factors, first of all, is how intense is the impact of COVID on the economy within which a project is operating? How heavily impacted are the partners that a program is working with? That is first consideration. The second one is what stage of program are you at? For instance, if you are just starting, or whether you are in the middle of it or you have been in there for the last 5 years, the stage of the program also is very critical in making a decision which way to go. Thirdly, I think there is the ease of change. Some of us are tied into specific contracts that to change, you require quite a lot of things to fall in place. I sit in a very exciting position in the sense that I am in a project activity that is just starting. So that has given me space to innovate. We have had to think creatively around the situation and try to find where we can fit in best to support the agricultural sector. I also want to say that in terms of the adjustment required, one has to adjust internally within the program and then adjust externally in facing the sector, which is the agricultural sector. So I can just give two quick examples of how we have done this. One, internally, we are doing all the startup activities online and remotely. A startup activity for an MSD program is crazy being done remotely. We are doing our baselines online using online tools rather than being in the field and talking to partners. Those are internal adjustments we have had to make. In terms of facing the marketplace, we have had to send out requests for ideas from the general market actors. And through that feedback, we have been able to identify the key constraints that businesses are facing at this time. And the three that popped out very largely are most agribusinesses are looking for new markets because their current markets have been disrupted. So, secondly, many of them are looking at ways of how to adjust their operations. So scenario planning, short-term planning, and changing strategy to address the current constraints. Then the third area where most businesses are looking at are areas around the survival of their logistics and supply chain. These are coming out as key areas that are of interest, and we are adjusting our program to address these particular constraints.
Okay, that's very interesting. So that's a new program with that flexibility. Deborah, what about a mature program that's already well established?
Yeah, so in NU-TEC MD, we've just finished our 5th year. So as Colin's saying, we're in a different life cycle of the program. So what we did is, we have about 60 companies that we're already working with, and we've, like typical MSD programs, we have a number of different business models that we've been piloting and working on over the last 5 years. So we made a strategic decision, actually, that we looked at our whole portfolio and we focused down on 2 of them or more effective business models that have reached sort of like the biggest numbers of people, about 200,000 beneficiaries, and how can we focus in and then adjust them and pivot them for the COVID response. And we're thinking more, not just lockdown, but more around the economic recovery. So this is quite important. So, and of course, within each of the business models, there's a number of companies that we've been working with. So it's not just a programmatic pivot, but also the companies within each of the models also need to pivot, because we can't just do as we've been doing. And so looking at our existing portfolio and determining which companies are actually willing to also adapt within that business model. So for instance, we're quite interested in e-commerce, looking at how, logistics, all of us are kind of, as we're in lockdown on some different level around the world, we've all been using different logistics providers to deliver food or groceries. And we're seeing actually this happening in northern Uganda as well, but maybe not as formally, where a farmer will call a supplier or an agri-dealer and then try to get some seeds, and then the agri-dealer will find a a motorcycle on the side and get them to deliver. So there's lots of texting, lots of calling going on. So there's a bit, maybe it's not as efficient as our efficient apps that we've been using, but we've been looking at that as this behavior change is happening. Can we leverage this going forward? And not just for lockdown, but also to create efficiencies in logistics in Uganda and northern Uganda. So for instance, in the same way that, Uber was a bit of a game changer in people movement, can we look at how logistics can change the way that, different apps can change the way that logistics are moved. So, I'm in Nairobi. Before Uber, I was paying 1,500 shillings or about $15, to go somewhere. So a taxi comes, picks me up and takes me to my point B, and then returns to his or her base. Once Uber came in, I'm paying half of that cost, like 750 shillings, because I'm paying the two, and then someone else pops in and pays the other route. So it's all this backhauling efficiencies with technologies that we could potentially be leveraging. And we know in northern Uganda, companies that are exporting goods, let's say out of northern Uganda, even down to Kampala or into Kenya, they're paying the to and the froing. Or if an agri-dealer wants to get seeds up to northern Uganda, they're having to pay both ways as well. So can we use these opportunities? Like always, market systems is around looking at the market and determining what are the opportunities. Can we use this opportunity that people are using these third-party logistics and leverage it, not just for now, not just for the economic recovery, but even going forward in Uganda for agriculture?
That's an optimistic thought. So look, so I'm jumping around a bit with this slide for some reason, but what would enable market systems development programs to adapt more rapidly to these kind of opportunities? Warwick, for example, in the finance sector. You're muted, Warwick, sorry. Warwick, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, folks. Sorry. I know that's really bad Zoom hygiene. Sorry. Okay, Mike, if I'm understanding your question right, I'll just talk a little wee bit here about the reality of doing this pivot administratively. Is that your question?
Yeah.
So,
what would expedite the sort of the changes that the programs need?
Okay. So my experience at the moment is that we have a lot of willing donors and development partners who themselves are very willing to repurpose funds and their agreements with us. They and we do also, of course, have administrations to satisfy, and standard procedures and governance processes and so forth. So all of this sort of needs to be dealt with, and it can take a very long time. I think really the lesson in here for us for now and the future is about being really good at our analysis and our presentation, and having very clear thoughts, and being able to come with defined, purposeful and measurable notions for intervention and for change, and to use the experience to really draw on the experience that as programs and institutions you've developed and the partnerships. And in our case, in the case of the Abbey companies, we've been in business for 10 years. We have an incredible asset in all of the systems and procedures that and partnership networks that have been running for a long time, have been perfected over the years. We also have a little advantage that we actually have a good amount of capital ourselves and a fairly short chain governance process to making decisions about deploying that. So I'm sort of reasonably optimistic, but we are asking, for example, our staff to take a turnabout on their feet. The things that we've implored them to do, like being very careful about risk and to follow standard operating procedures and to adhere to these good principles we all know, we now sort of talk to them across the telephone and distance places and ask them to compromise on many of these things. So it's really quite challenging, I think, administratively. Collins, you might have something to say about that as well.
Right.
Yeah, Collins,
Yes, if I may jump in here. I do not have real experience within my current program on how to deal with this, but I can just offer some suggestions on how this can be done. First of all, this is not the period to do long, drawn-out market systems assessments. We have to be creative on simpler ways of gathering information and deciding the direction to move. I think the real test of how we respond will depend a lot on how entrepreneurial our programs and activities are. We can't expect actors to be entrepreneurial when within our own activities we are stuck in old ways. I think this requires very expedited processes of developing the intervention and actual moving into the marketplace. So it does not need to be simplified to a point that we lose out the real goal of making markets to function better, but they should be done in a way that cuts off a lot of the waste of time that goes into the back and forth in order for the activity or program to respond quickly. I would also suggest that it is at this point when even the approval processes that go on between the donors and the implementing agencies need to be looked at a little bit with some level of comfort, meaning that we need processes that ensure that risks are minimized, but allows room for fast action. Otherwise, if it takes a very long time, then you end up responding when the crisis has gone, and then we become irrelevant to the situation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So just on that point there, Deborah, how do you get that balance with some due diligence in this kind of rapid response?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to meet, as Collins is saying, I mean, what is due diligence? Due diligence is around mitigating risk. So we don't want to just blanket invest in companies. We still need to make sure, are these companies going to survive? Do they have the foundations? And also, is the business model viable? So let's still do our financials around that. Let's still see, is there a break-even point? Does this actually make sense? Because otherwise we're just going to throw money out. So it's still around investing wisely, and it's still around those key principles of market systems around smart subsidy, right? Not just subsidizing anything, but subsidizing, making the money work well.
Okay, so let's go back to our kind of market systems development principles. I mean, how rigid do we need to be in terms of sticking to those principles, like issues around subsidies? I know this is a dilemma at a time like this. I mean, Warwick, what's your thoughts?
Well, I may not be the world's best purist. I mean, my thoughts are that this is the time to drop the dogma and get on with it. and we don't have time. Time is not our friend. We count in Uganda, certainly with two cropping seasons a year. We count the seasons in days and weeks, not in quarters and years. Right now, decisions are being made that will determine whether there's a commercial second crop. There'll be decisions about fertilizer and seed imports and orders and so forth. And we simply need to step up and be there and make sure those supply chains continue to work. And that would mean compromising on many of these dearly held market systems principles. Now, that's not the same thing as committing acts of stupidity. There are trading chains that need to be respected, because we also have a responsibility to make sure that we protect the various actors along the value chains. So we don't sort of walk around throwing money out the window of cars, but we can do things, for example, like ensuring that even paying for inputs to be purchased, which is a sort of a proxy for money without actually throwing money as cash notes. So I think these are the sort of things that we need to do. And we also need to work with the various actors to make sure that there are notions of confidence, that traders are feeling that they can move product, that they'll be able to access banks. And we'll talk about that in a wee while, about the role we can have in convening and joining people up.
Okay. Collins, what do you think about this question about how you choose who to support or who to bail out, and how you avoid creating that kind of dependency that might arise if you do?
Thanks. I agree with what Warwick has said, and I want to start by actually saying that just by listening to CNN, you hear bailouts everywhere. So I don't see why agribusinesses and farmers in Africa should not get bailout. So Ugandan agribusinesses and farmers need bailout. The question is, where do we get the resources to do that bailout? Another question is, does a program or activity or a project have enough money to actually give bailout? And given that situation then, means that we have to decide carefully as projects what we can actually do sustainably. In my case, I'm not in that situation of having to consider bailouts. However, for the partners that we are going to onboard during this period, we will look carefully at their most serious issue that they are faced with, and then change our own internal guidelines in the proportion of investment that the activity will provide. I think it is within the capacity of most projects and activities to change those guidelines to align to support businesses that need support. I think we can use the resources we have intelligently in order to provide additional support that would not otherwise have been given under the purist approach. And then I would also suggest that in doing so, we need to be very specific on how we are going to exit. So I'll give you a simple example. Some of the companies that have applied to us are asking for support around scenario planning and planning for the short to medium term. That you can provide and know that by the end of the crisis, you can easily step back and leave them to continue on their own. So I think it is a matter of identifying where you put your limited bailout with a very clear exit plan in the medium term.
Okay. And Debora, any thoughts from you, from NU-TEC's experience or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I mean, we've got already a portfolio of 60 companies, and I think absolutely we've been exploring additional ways that we might help these companies during this time, whether that's paying interest payments or getting money to them earlier, or if logistics costs are more expensive, let's say subsidizing some of that in the short term. But I also think we have to be careful not to just in general blanket bailout. And again, I'm going back to my point around smart subsidy. I think, you know, in business in general, it's a bit of an adapt or die situation for most companies. This situation has taken it to a bit of a degree here, but it's really that same principle that if companies don't innovate and adapt and adjust, they are not going to survive. So it's about having a process where we can actually analyze that and determine that, so we don't just kind of give to everyone, but let's find the smart, the innovation, the solid companies, or the companies that we know if we give them a bit of help, they're actually going to take that and run with that, and not maintaining, let's say, old ways of doing things just for the sake. I think it's quite difficult as, you know, in a mature program, because it's all those sunk costs, isn't it? All that time, all that energy, those relationships we spent with companies, and we have to be a bit hard-nosed about these things as well. So.
Okay. Okay, look, I want to broaden the conversation out a little bit, because I know there may be people listening who are not so familiar with market systems development approach, or people who simply asking the question, well, all this talk about supporting companies and bailing out agribusiness and so on, what about the really vulnerable households who are on the starvation line at the moment? There's a lot of social protection that's needed. A lot of one of the people on has already pointed out, you know, the impact of this crisis is very much on women particularly. So is there any role for MSD programs in relation to these bigger questions around how we protect people, particularly vulnerable parts of the community, smallholder farmers and women farmers and so on? Is there some role that we can play in supporting that wider response to the COVID crisis? And I'd like to start asking Collins with that question, if you don't mind. What can you see your program doing?
Thank you. I think when I see most efforts within Uganda, they have been looking at the impact of COVID at a very high level, economy level, and a few are now coming in that are looking at impact on agribusiness. What has not come out very strongly is the impact of COVID at the household level, at the farmer level, and especially at the level of organizations that serve farmers. So cooperatives, producer organizations, very little is known at that point. So as a program, one of the things that we are currently doing is to look at how can we get enough evidence at the household level, at the producer level, at the cooperative level, to give us a sense of the actual impact so that we can quantify that impact, to give us a sense on how are farmers and the rural organizations that serve them, how are they responding, so that we can have some sense of good practice on how to interact with farmers during this time. We are also doing the study to try and understand more broadly what channels can actually serve the farmers better during this period. That study, we hope, can be used to influence how others can interact with farmers and households in the rural areas.
Okay, that sounds great. What about Warwick? Let me put that same question to you, really. What do you think the role is, thinking of your companies and so on?
Well, I think if I could just go on a little bit from Collins, I think you know, we do, most of our institutions, and the sort of nature of MSD is that we are quite good at sort of gathering in facts and evidence and information and understanding, you know, how people all along the, you know, how people are impacted by our programs. What we need to be a little bit better at doing, I think, is to communicate that, especially to government. I think we're quite good at communicating amongst ourselves, but we often don't use that real power we have to tell real human stories to government, to tell them, to help guide their decision making. So we have a real role, I think, in getting our evidence beyond our own boundaries as organisations. So communication, and communication that's reliable. And when I talked earlier about what sort of interventions, short, sharp, well-defined interventions, also interventions that have really dependable measurements associated with them, and things that people understand, like receipts and weighbridge dockets and using last hard number logic. The things we need to do to build confidence in the stories we tell, so we can also work with government and inform government programs. So I think we've got a great big role to play in that. If we don't work closer with government will, and I can refer particularly to government in Uganda now, we're in an election year soon, government will step in and do what they do well, which is intervening and going into a handout mode. And, you know, we can't do everything for everyone in our MSD programs, but the people we can work with, the people who are associated with our value chains, we need to be sure that the right things are done for them, also beyond the scope of our resources. So I think that's really important.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Look, I'm going to give a final word to you, Debora, and particularly on this question. But also, I'm thinking, you know, can we reflect on any lessons from previous crises or other similar sorts of scenarios?
Yeah, so just to Warwick's point around handouts, I think we're learning now in the MSD field in the last few years around market systems approaches in these protracted crisis situations. So for instance, as NU-TEC MD, we've been involved a little bit in northern Uganda around the South Sudanese refugees that have come in, and you know, in those sorts of situations, we have handouts and handouts and handouts. And in trying to look at how can MSD approaches come in, so I think we have to be really influential towards government or development partners or NGOs who might take, let's say, more of a short-term humanitarian approach of handouts at that smallholder farmer level, which we know, and evidence and experience has shown us has negative impacts on the private sector. So for instance, handing out seeds, handing out tools, directly, which we've seen what happens is it shifts seed suppliers, seed companies, it shifts agri-dealers to procuring to NGOs and government versus actually what they're supposed to be doing, which is distributing in their, to people, to consumers. And so we as MSD programs, I believe we have a voice to actually be saying, actually, let's do handouts or bailouts in a way that protects the private sector, because ultimately, if it's a one-off thing, that's fine, but the private sector is going to be there subsequently to distribute. So let's not destroy it in the process. Again, it's being smart and it's doing it well, but absolutely, as I agree with Collins, there should be something for farmers during this time. Let's put our evidence and voice into that and make it happen well.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's been fascinating. you've also done brilliantly in terms of keeping to good time. So we still have 15-20 minutes left for questions from the audience. I'm going to scan through them quickly now and pick out ones possibly slightly at random. I hope not. But let's start with a question from Eliza Mandeli. She was asking us about, or pointing out that during this crisis, there's a tendency for short-term relief and quick fixes to be implemented by governments and agencies. And what arguments could we bring forward to convince donors of the importance of a systemic, sustainable kind of approach, in other words, an MSD type approach? I don't know whether that's something you could look at, Warwick.
Well, I mean, personally, I'm not sure that it's the time to go out and sell MSD too dogmatically. I think what we need to be convincing our sponsors is that we are able to bring to them really pragmatic solutions. And I think not necessarily packed in with the rhetoric and so forth of MSD jargon. Private sector approaches, absolutely. Thinking about sustainability, paying more attention to looking at businesses' books and old-fashioned business performance and planning for that. I think that's what we will do best to focus on.
Thank you. Did you want to jump in, Collins?
Yes, I was just going to add on what Warwick has said and say that really what will differentiate us from other programs is our ability to respond rapidly and show results. If we can do that, then people will be convinced that if you want to really address an issue, whether it is a humanitarian crisis or other things, use market systems approach, use the private sector to deliver it efficiently. If we can demonstrate that, then we don't need to write any big documents to convince anyone.
And also just remembering, I mean, it's economic recovery, right? Where as lockdowns are being lifted, we're now focusing on economic recovery. What can we do quickly to help that happen? And the evidence around our previous years, the evidence around, we can help in aggregation, we can help in inputs, we can help you make sure that your bailouts are private sector friendly. And here's some evidence around that, pushing that, giving a voice. But we need to be involved in that dialogue and not just sit back and only work quietly with the private sector. Let's get our voice out there and say that we do have relevance in this response, because we can respond in ways that protect and maintain the private sector and get them to be helping in the economic recovery.
Okay, thank you. What about, picking up on Olivia Hartigan's question, how do we ensure women are included in the responses and the reactions to this crisis?
Just vote for one as your Prime Minister. That's a sure.
Yeah.
I want to I'll just be a bit light about this for a second. I promised that I'd talk about timeliness, and I just wanted to reflect. Within weeks of New Zealand announcing COVID, I'm sitting in New Zealand, government made it possible to apply and receive wage support, wage subsidies. And I think about 1.5 million New Zealanders used 10 minutes online to apply for 3 months of wage subsidy and had it within 3 days. It was truly remarkable. I don't think we've ever seen so much cash come out of the Treasury. And why can you do that? You can do that because there's a lot of trust in the system. Anyway, I didn't answer the question.
Right. If I can just jump in on that. I am lucky that my activity is just starting. So one of the criteria that we put very highly and provided a very high proportion of points to was inclusion of women, and especially looking at whether women would disproportionately benefit from any intervention that we engage in. So that was an adjustment we did right within the program to make sure that we capture interventions that actually focus on women and would have a lot of benefits accruing to women. But more specifically, I think agriculture is predominant in Uganda is predominantly being run by women. And you go to farmer-based organizations in the rural areas, you find quite a good representation of women. So I think, to me, ensuring that the actual benefits of trade between the agribusinesses and the farmers is improved so that value can be transferred is something that we will be monitoring as we invest in the few activities we will do during this COVID period.
So look, there's a sort of possibly a related question here. Gordon says, or he points out that in many cases, local, shorter value chains might be more resilient than, say, long international global value chains. And does this create an opportunity for us as practitioners? Do we need to sort of rethink strategically what we're aiming for?
Yeah, maybe I can just jump in here.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we've seen some challenges around export. I mean, I was looking at, you know, these long lines of trucks trying to cross the border. I know that there's been a desire to see the borders continue to flow, but we know that the reality is not there. Just in terms of flights going out, so let's say horticulture exports or other exports, cotton prices dropping, sesame prices dropping. And we've really thought about that. Do we need to think more around food crops, around regional food crops? And that's almost a, you know, a food security protection element, but also just, you know, within Uganda and within the region, can we shift some of these, let's say, you know, companies that are focusing exclusively on export crops and use their existing aggregation systems to buy grains and get that into the market? Absolutely, it's an opportunity.
Right. I mean, when you look at it with the restricted movements, actually, you can't try to still continue looking at value chains that are very long. For purposes of survival, you must now look at small regional markets, district markets, and what have you, and try to make businesses to work within those spaces. So in the selection of ideas that we have picked for responding to COVID, we are looking at how do we enable businesses to operate within the areas where they are and find new channels for distribution, new channels for reaching markets. The reason being, they'll not be allowed to go so far. And if they were to go across borders, the lines at borders for COVID testing takes 4 days. That is additional cost to operations. So I do agree with the question with the suggestion that at this time, it might make sense to focus on shorter value chains. Regional, when I talk of regional, is like district or markets of a certain part of the country, like Western Uganda, Northern Uganda, because that is what can practically be done without increasing the costs of operation.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I might weigh in there as well and say that I think there's also a bit of a case maybe for us not trying to be too clever about which value chains we choose. Business is actually reasonably good at choosing those for themselves, and perhaps what we need to focus more and more on are the horizontal markets. The business of trading food, for example, usually involves many different value chains. The same with storage and cleaning and processing, and finance, for example. So I think it's not a bad time for us to respect that the private sector's got pretty strong instincts in this regard as well, and maybe not try to finesse our focus too much, I think.
Okay. Slight change of subject. There was a question that came in earlier during the registrations, or there were several questions from people talking about the challenges facing training-related services given social distancing. And I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts about how to make training services, knowledge information services available to people in the context of social distancing and movement restrictions and so on.
Well, I think for me, lead on that, I think there's been no time like this to be developing our sort of digital products and our media, our media-based products. We've had some real success, I think, with sponsoring some of the edu dramas, Shamba Shake Up, I think we call it in Kenya, and in Uganda we have another name for it. That's a sort of a series of television shows that delivers in reality television, delivers sort of agricultural messaging. Radio talk shows, I think, using them more and more. Telephone SMS-based systems. I mean, in many parts of the world, the notion of an extensionist having to be a pair of legs on the ground has been disappearing for a long time. We're a bit slow, I think, on that in East Africa, and it's time that it took off a bit more, I think.
Collins, you have some thoughts, I think.
Yes, I think the need for social distancing will push all training service providers and extension service providers to new space. In my case, we have had to identify a potential service provider who will be developing very short, smart handbooks that can be sent out digitally on phones and also in print that explain how to do a specific agronomy. So this we are supporting so that this information can be sent out to farmers out there as part of the extension. But it will also be accompanied by short videos that explain the practical aspects of that agronomy so that farmers can relate to this wherever they are without the need for classroom type or field level extension. In terms of training, I think I've already seen quite a bit going on online, and maybe we need to start finding applications or apps that can actually support online training. There is one that I've been using, and I'm not marketing this particular app, but there is one called Nearpod, which is very useful for training. You can use it remotely and you can interact with as many people as possible. The use of Teams, Microsoft Teams and Zoom and everything, this will become the new way of doing things. And you can actually achieve quite a lot if the purpose and the objective of the training is well understood and people know the rules governing that training period. So I think this is the time for people to wear their innovation hats and just do it. It is possible and it will work, I think.
Thank you. Okay, look, well, I hope this webinar is an example of good use of digital technology to spread knowledge and information. A few people have asked, by the way, whether the recording will be available, and absolutely it will be on the Beam Exchange webinar page. We're going to give you a link in a minute, or Isabel might put it in the chat box as I'm speaking. But yes, you can find a recording, and please do. It'll be on our YouTube channel. Please do share it. I have a final question, again, broadening it out a little bit, guys, so a little bit of a challenging question, but John Chettleborough says, you know, the focus of our conversation has been very much on the immediate responses, and that's fair enough given the intensity of the crisis. But what do you think the impact will be longer term on the sort of design and the strategy of market assistance development programs? Where do you think we're going in the future with this? What's going to be the long-term impact? Anyone want to stick their neck out and answer that? Deborah, you haven't spoken for a while.
Well, I mean, I think kind of a lot of what we've said, isn't it, is but we got to get quicker. We got to communicate our evidence, what we've been able to achieve. We've got to work with, you know, mitigate our risks, but actually find the stars, the companies out there that are actually changing things. Let's make ourselves relevant by being on the cusp of some of these changes that can happen. You know, society's changing. Let's help be on that cusp of that shift. So, you know, I mean, is it an MSD? Is it a private sector? I think, again, as we've said, broadening out the range of things that we do, whether that's a bit more advocacy, whether that's pushing around, you know, better subsidies, but actually doing more than we typically have, that will keep us relevant going forward. And we'll have to determine how long that will need to go for.
Thank you. What's the future for market systems development for a more resilient market systems that are more about protecting people from shocks and marginalisation? What do you think there, Colin? Oh, Colin's frozen. Have we lost him?
Colin's frozen. Yeah.
Warwick, do you have any thoughts about the future design of programs in a world where we're more focused on resilience rather than international global value chains, maybe? What do you think?
Surprise question. I haven't thought about it too much, Mike. I mean, I think I'd kind of like us to do whatever we can to be real. You know, when it took me, I was quite a late comer to MSD speak, I guess. And I think understanding the kind of the whole language that is spoken by this methodology remains still probably a bit intimidating for a lot of people. You know, I mean, I would really challenge practitioners to try and really understand what makes small businesses work, and larger business as well, and how finance, everybody needs to understand how finance works. In the time we've had this meeting and prepared for it, you know, you couldn't count on your hands in Uganda how many SMEs have bled to death, really. So, you know, we need to really focus, I think, on being real and pragmatic, and whatever we can do to do that is a good thing.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we seem to have lost Collins, but we are at the end of the hour, so I was going to wrap up anyway. It's been really fascinating talk. It's been a great conversation. Thank you very much. I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. I mentioned, let me just see if I can share my screen again. So the recording will be available on our website. There's a link there, beamexchange.org/community/webinar. Please do look at that. In the chat box about now, I'm hoping that Isabel will have posted a link to our feedback form. So we just would absolutely love to get your personal feedback on this webinar, what's been good about it. Oh, welcome back, Colin.
Sorry.
Yeah, welcome back. Please do give us your feedback. It really helps us improve these webinars, and we're interested to know what you thought about it. Otherwise, it only serves really me to say thank you again to Warwick Thomson, Debora Randall, and you, Colin Apuoyo, for a great session. please do come and join us for another Beam Exchange hosted webinar in about 3 weeks' time. You'll find details on the Beam Exchange website. Any very, very quick final words from the three of you?
I know.
Right.
Thanks very much for the opportunity, and I've enjoyed the company of my panelists, Mike and Isabel, and thank you very much to all the participants who showed up today. Much appreciated.
Right.
Okay. Mike, if you allow me just 1 minute, I got lost a bit. The trouble of living in these parts of the world. Okay. I just wanted to say something with regard to the future of MSDs going forward. We have seen how a pandemic like this can actually disrupt individual businesses, but and a focus of an MSD program should no longer be on individual businesses, but should look at the various interconnection between businesses and try to strengthen that interconnection. So I think we need to move towards looking at how does an MSD program strengthen the resilience of the marketplace rather than the resilience of an individual business. As we move forward, I think MSD programs working in a country should look at which are the core cross-market functions that would keep the market working during any particular period and invest to strengthen those cross-market functions rather than focusing on individual businesses and their operations. That is my thought at the moment.
Okay.
Otherwise, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to share the podium with the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure. Deborah.
And maybe I can just say, I mean, it's a shame we haven't been able to answer. There's some really interesting questions that's come on. And maybe, Mike, is there, you know, there was a dialogue on the Beam website. Maybe we could move that and just have an online dialogue around that, because I'd love to be able to input back and forth. And one of the things I think we all recognize as panelists is we're not experts here. We're all in this around the world as MSD practitioners in the same place, trying to figure out what to do. We don't have all the answers. Let's dialogue, let's connect, and let's learn from each other as we go forward to make this sector stronger and better so that we're relevant to this response. Absolutely,
absolutely. I'm totally behind that. And so, yeah, forgive me for not mentioning that we have a forum on LinkedIn, if you use that platform, but on LinkedIn, if you search for the Beam Exchange or the Beam Forum, you'll find, and again, you can get a link to our website, but you'll find conversations there. And what we can very easily do, Deborah, is start some conversation threads on that forum. Yes. They will be reflected on the website as well. They get picked up automatically by our conversation board on the website. But yeah, that's the place to go to ask your questions to these guys. I mean, well, Deborah, you can start a conversation there, and people will see it. And then if you want to take your questions out of this space and onto that forum, please do. And Deborah, Warwick, and Collins will, I'm sure, be very happy to respond to you. And we can even see how it goes from there. There are other options like posting further videos on the webinar page. But yeah, keep in touch with the Beam Exchange, the forum or the webinar page, and you'll find more information rolling out from this conversation. And I look forward to hearing you or seeing you in that space. But for now, thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.